Hello folks, tonight we begin in a place where bedtime means freezing air, a mattress made of glorified livestock feed, and the gentle lullaby of a grandfather wheezing into the darkness while a goat chews something that used to be your shoe. Welcome to the 1300s, where going to sleep was less about comfort and more about not waking up dead. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. When medieval peasants went to bed, they were not easing into memory foam, they were easing into frostbite. The sun disappeared, the fire sagged into a smoky sigh, and the house turned into a cold box, wrapped in false promises and wet thatch. There was no insulation, no double glazing, no heated floors or Instagrammable throws. Just air that wandered in uninvited and made itself comfortable. Most families slept in a single room, sometimes a single bed. Privacy was not so much rare as mythical. Children, parents, grandparents, and at least one overly entitled animal all shared the same cramped space. And that goat? It never slept where it was supposed to. Sometimes it shared the bed. Sometimes it slept on top of the bedding. Sometimes it stared at everyone through the darkness like it had seen things and was not ready to talk about them. Beds, when they existed, were simple wooden frames holding straw mattresses. If they did not exist, the floor would have to do. The mattress was a sack filled with straw, hay, or rushes. It sounded romantic, something you might read in a rustic bed and breakfast brochure, until you remembered that it flattened in days, molded in weeks, and started to crawl if ignored for too long. It smelled like damp, sounded like a cereal box being stepped on, and felt like sleeping on a lightly disguised compost heap. The fire in the hearth was the closest thing to central heating, mood lighting, and pest control, all in one. On a good night, it glowed softly, warming the nearest few inches. On a bad night, it smoked like a collapsing haystack and offered just enough heat to encourage false hope. Most homes did not have chimneys, just holes in the roof where smoke might drift upward, or just as often decide to loiter indoors like a passive-aggressive dinner guest. To sleep far from the fire meant sleeping cold. That was the lesser bed. You did not choose that spot. It was assigned by fate, birth order, or whoever claimed it first. The farther from the hearth, the more layers you needed, and peasants did not own many layers. A tunic, a cloak, and maybe, if luck smiled, a sack you could repurpose as a blanket. Softness was a rumor. Warmth was earned. The floor itself was packed earth. During dry weather, it felt like sleeping on a dusty bread crust. During wet weather, it welcomed mud from the ground and rain from the ceiling, transforming into something between a swamp and a particularly judgmental bog. Floors were often covered with rushes or herbs, meant to mask odors and absorb moisture. These rushes were replaced periodically, by which I mean new ones were thrown on top of old ones until the floor became a layered scrapbook of historic foot traffic and spilled stew. Walls were no better. Most homes were built with wattle and daub, woven sticks smeared with a glorious mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. It was not just tolerated, it was celebrated for its insulating properties. People slapped it onto the walls with satisfaction, knowing it would keep out the wind and trap in the smell of goat. Over time, these walls cracked, sagged, and sometimes fell apart when you leaned on them too confidently. Roofs, usually thatched, added to the charm. They were warmish, picturesque, and absolutely full of bugs. Fleas lived there, Lice dropped in for surprise visits. Occasionally, mice nested in the thatch and decided to join you mid-dream. It was an ecosystem, a vibrant little community of creatures working together to ensure no one ever truly relaxed. As for sleeping arrangements, the general rule was as many bodies as possible per bedding surface. Whole families crowded together in a single bed. Children were wedged between adults, both for protection and to keep them from wandering off in the night. Elders were positioned near the heat. The youngest, small, wriggly, and constantly sticky, were rolled in cloth like mini root vegetables and placed in the warmest spots. No one had their own blanket. There was a blanket. And if someone hogged it, justice was swift and involved several bony elbows. The night was not quiet. People snored, muttered, coughed, and occasionally made nighttime exits involving chamber pots and hushed arguments. Livestock stirred in the corners, dogs thumped in their sleep. Someone always farted dramatically and pretended to be unconscious. There was no white noise machine. The white noise was the house settling, the wind whistling, and your cousin grinding his teeth like he owed the world an apology. Banking the fire before bed was essential. This meant covering the embers in ash to keep them alive through the night. A proper banked fire would survive until morning, ready to be coaxed back to life with some twigs and strategic muttering. If it failed, the house went cold fast. And relighting it in the dark, with cold fingers and damp kindling, was the kind of task that made people consider giving up and inventing spring. Sleep itself came in bursts. Long, uninterrupted rest was rare. People shifted, rolled over, complained quietly, or got up to poke the fire, reposition a log, or scowl at the goat. Dreams were vivid, half-remembered, and often involved food. Nightmares featured wolves, famine, or your roof caving in mid-blizzard, which was not symbolic, just statistically likely. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Infants, elders, and anyone who had lost their blanket to a particularly selfish sibling were at risk. Every winter claimed victims, not from plague, not from wolves, but simply from cold. People went to bed unsure if they would wake up. That was the bar. Waking up with all 10 toes was a solid win. So people adapted, they layered, they huddled, they trained themselves to sleep without moving too much. They learned to live with the smoke, the cold, the scratching, and the feeling that something in the straw might be watching. They accepted that life meant sleeping beside a wall made of dung, wrapped in a blanket made of wool and hope, breathing air that had passed through 6 other people and a goat. Comfort was never the goal. Survival was. And yet, for all that, they managed. They managed to sleep, to dream, to wake up and do it again the next night. Because this was not a life built around softness. It was a life built around getting through things one cold night at a time. So the next time your memory foam feels a bit firm, or your blanket slips slightly off one shoulder, remember that somewhere in history, a peasant woke up covered in straw, frozen breath fogging in the air, a chicken sitting on his leg, and still got up to shovel mud for 10 hours. Must be nice. Night in a medieval home did not end when the sun went down and everyone collapsed into the straw pile. It paused. Somewhere between midnight and early morning, people often found themselves awake. Not alarmed, just conscious. The fire hissed softly. The wind crept through the walls like it had paid rent. Someone sneezed. Someone else shifted. And for an hour or two, everything hovered between sleep and activity in a way that felt almost intentional. This was not insomnia. This was the watch, the middle phase in what modern scholars call segmented sleep. Across Europe, From rural villages to townhouses, people routinely slept in 2 shifts, a first sleep, then an hour or 2 of wakefulness, followed by a second sleep that carried them through to dawn. Medical texts, legal documents, and devotional writings all reference it casually, like it was as normal as cold porridge and itchy wool. The idea of sleeping through the night in a single, unbroken stretch would have sounded deeply strange. People expected to wake up for a bit, and when they did, they had things to do. The watch was quiet, domestic, and flexible. Some sat up near the hearth, poking at the embers and adjusting logs like miniature fire gods. Others tended to small chores, mending garments, carding wool, inspecting tools, or folding laundry that had somehow avoided the damp floor. The silence of the hour made it perfect for uninterrupted work, assuming the fire cooperated and the goat was not stepping on anything flammable again. In wealthier homes, those with candles and literacy, the watch was often used for reading, writing, or conversation. Curtains might be drawn around the bed for warmth, and inside that small, breath-warmed cave, people whispered about business, dreams, family disputes, or whether it had been a rat or a saint that rustled the rushes earlier. Religious devotion flourished during the watch. Monastic orders broke the night into segments with purpose-built prayer routines. Matins typically fell between midnight and 2 a.m., dragging sleepy monks out of their beds to chant by candlelight in drafty stone halls. Outside the monasteries, ordinary villagers recited psalms, whispered pleas to saints, or lit tiny lanterns to ward off nightmares. The boundary between dreaming and divine communication was blurry. It was often safer to assume that any particularly weird dream came straight from heaven and should probably be acted on before breakfast. Dream interpretation was a favorite medieval pastime. Entire manuals were written explaining how to read the signs delivered during sleep. Teeth falling out, possibly death, or wealth, or betrayal. Flying through the air, spiritual ascension, or demonic possession. A pig speaking Latin. That one might require a priest, or a different dinner plan. For many, the watch became a period of reflection on these visions, passed between family members like half-baked prophecies wrapped in hay-scented metaphors. In some regions, the watch had a more social flavor. Court records from England and France include complaints of people sneaking out during the night for less than pious reasons. The darkness offered privacy. If someone returned to bed with straw in suspicious places and a suspicious expression, it was politely ignored, until the baby arrived and everyone had to redo the property lines. And then there were the food people. Some believed a warm drink or small meal during the watch helped ease digestion and prepare the body for second sleep. Recipes survived for mulled wine with egg yolk, spiced ale, or soft bread soaked in broth. One recipe involved heating milk with herbs and adding beer, presumably to distract from the flavor by making the drink legally intoxicating. It was culinary multitasking, hydration, sedation, and spiritual surrender, all in one wooden cup. Lighting was minimal. Candles were expensive, smoky, and made from tallow, rendered animal fat that smelled exactly like it sounds. Most households relied on the glow of the fire, a dying ember tucked under ash, to preserve a heat. Fire was everything: warmth, light, security, and the most emotionally manipulative member of the household. If it flickered too low, someone had to rebuild it. If it went out completely, there followed a half hour of flint striking, smoke coughing, and whispered curses delivered to St. Ignatius of misfires. Silence during the watch was relative. There were creaking beams, animal huffs, the occasional rush of wind that sounded like an omen. Someone snored, someone mumbled, someone shuffled toward the chamber pot with the urgency of a person racing against both time and dignity. Outside, dogs barked, owls hooted, foxes did whatever foxes did. The world was not asleep, it was listening. This period of semi-wakefulness also served as a social safety valve. In cramped homes with little privacy, the night watch allowed moments of autonomy. A person could think, plan, rehash the day's conversations, or mentally edit tomorrow's arguments. It was introspection 1300 style, done in silence, by firelight, while slowly losing feeling in both feet. In some towns, communal living arrangements blurred the lines even further. Shared walls and open courtyards meant that nocturnal activity was not limited to one household. If someone in the next building started playing a lute, reciting a poem, or having a loud theological debate with themselves, the sound carried. The community slept like an orchestra, mostly in unison, occasionally punctuated by a rogue trumpet. One fringe belief held that this mid-sleep wakefulness allowed the soul to briefly leave the body and wander. It was not framed as astral projection or spiritual danger, more like a built-in recess. Some religious thinkers claimed that second sleep, once resumed, was when the body truly healed and the soul returned refreshed, presumably after spending an hour or two judging the neighbors. Clothing during the watch varied by class and temperature. Some remained bundled in their sleeping clothes. Others added extra layers, a second tunic, a cloak, a hat. A lucky few had a warm stone wrapped in cloth set beside them to mimic the sensation of comfort. Wool socks were rare. Wool rags wrapped around the feet were common and just as itchy. Fashion was not the point, avoiding frostbite was. The room itself during the watch was a sensory contradiction. The fire glowed faintly, breath fogged in the air. The rushes crackled underfoot, dry and fragrant, but always one spark away from flambe. Shadows twitched across the walls, distant sounds filtered in, the echo of footsteps, the bark of a dog, a rooster misjudging the hour by a solid 90 minutes. The night was not static, it breathed. Eventually, the body called for rest again. Second sleep arrived slowly like a cat reconsidering its position. The fire dimmed to a glow. The household sighed back into silence. Some drifted off immediately, others lay awake, blinking at the thatch, mentally reshuffling straw to avoid pokey bits. Second sleep was deeper, slower, not because it was longer, but because the body had already done half the work. According to some medieval medical theories, second sleep was the more restorative of the two. It was when digestion completed, when the humors realigned, and when the soul, if it had taken a brief midnight vacation, slid quietly back into place. Whether any of this was biologically accurate did not matter. What mattered was the feeling, a gradual, warm sinking into quiet that signaled the night was ending and morning was not far off. Segmented sleep did not vanish overnight. It lingered for centuries, especially in rural areas. But as urban lighting, factory schedules, and coffee crept into daily life, the two sleep pattern began to fade. People compressed their nights, they forgot the watch, and eventually they began to treat midnight wakefulness as a flaw, rather than a centuries-old norm. But for a long time, the night had three acts: sleep, watch, and sleep again. It was routine, expected, ordinary. In the same way that breathing pauses between sentences, the watch was a natural pause between sleeps. The world did not stop spinning. It just waited. The medieval morning did not begin with birdsong and dewy optimism. It began with someone rolling over, groaning into a shared blanket, and realizing that the fire was mostly dead again. The second sleep, shorter, deeper, colder, had ended not with a peaceful sigh, but with the familiar soundtrack of chickens asserting dominance, children announcing hunger, and someone stepping into something they had meant to clean the night before. People rose in layers, not social layers, literal ones. Blankets, cloaks, clothing, possibly another person or a disoriented goat. Untangling oneself from the communal bed required patience and a strong stomach. If the mattress had not collapsed entirely, it had at least committed to a new shape during the night. Straw poked out like judgmental spines. The smell of smoke, sweat, wool, and fermented shoe dominated the air. It was not offensive so much as omnipresent. A background note of survival. Mornings were chore-heavy from the start. There were no leisurely routines, no coffee, no meditation apps. The fire needed rebuilding. That meant pushing aside ash, coaxing the embers, adding wood, blowing steadily until it caught, then immediately blaming whoever let it go out in the first place. There was always someone to blame. Usually the youngest, or the quietest, or whoever had claimed to bank it properly the night before and then fallen asleep halfway through the job. The fire was not just a comfort, it was a requirement. It heated food, dried clothing, kept people alive. Without it, the day began in cold silence, broken only by complaints and the sound of someone trying to wring life out of wet kindling. In summer, it was merely inconvenient. In winter, it bordered on dangerous. The urgency to relight it bordered on sacred obligation. Once the fire was stable, the real work began. Animal care, water hauling, food preparation, and anything that had not been completed the previous evening. This was not optional. Chickens did not wait politely. Cows were indifferent to excuses. Goats demanded immediate attention, often in the form of climbing things they were not supposed to climb or staring unsettlingly at nothing in particular. Most people did not change clothes upon waking. They were already dressed, partly for warmth, partly for practicality, and partly because removing clothes in the night was a luxury reserved for those with both privacy and the capacity to not freeze. The same tunic, cloak, and leggings that served as sleepwear became workwear. If an extra layer had been added in the night, it stayed on until sweat dictated otherwise. Laundry cycles operated on a seasonal basis and were scheduled with the same enthusiasm as minor surgery. Beds were stripped only if absolutely necessary. More often, they were rearranged with a few firm pats and a sigh. Bedding might be shaken out, inspected for surprises, and layered anew. There was no sense in fussing. If a rat had taken up residence in the straw, it was either evicted with a broom or tolerated until it relocated voluntarily. The chamber pot, if one existed, needed to be emptied. This was not a glamorous job. It was often assigned to children or the unlucky adult who stepped in something first. The contents were thrown into the street, into a designated pit, or, if feeling particularly civic-minded, into the garden. Public sanitation laws existed in theory. In practice, morning routines involved carefully not stepping in yesterday. Food preparation was rudimentary and immediate. There was no pantry full of options. Breakfast, when it happened, involved bread, if it had survived the night, porridge, if there was grain, or ale, if someone had given up entirely. Eggs were prized. Cheese was occasional. Leftovers from the previous night were rare because the concept of leftovers required having enough in the first place. Meals were practical, blunt instruments designed to fuel the body, not entertain the palate. In some households, especially wealthier ones, mornings included prayer. Not elaborate rituals, brief, whispered acknowledgements of survival. A moment of thanks for making it through another night. A nod to the saints. A hope that no one had died during the second sleep. Children were counted. Elders were checked. The silence of the early hours was broken only if something was wrong, or if someone had a particularly enthusiastic sneeze. The home, by morning, had changed character. What had been a dense cluster of sleeping bodies became a scatterplot of movement. The hearth regained its central role. Adults moved purposefully, children trailed behind or attempted to sneak outside. The goat resumed its career as a domestic liability. Beds were nudged aside. Floor rushes were swept if they had reached critical mass. If the house had a table, it was cleared of the night's clutter and repurposed for food, work, or stern conversation. Personal hygiene, such as it was, occurred quickly and without fanfare. Water was cold, soap was rare. Teeth were mostly ignored unless they actively complained. A handful of people rinsed their mouths with vinegar. A few wiped their faces with a damp cloth. Bathing, in the full sense, was a separate ordeal reserved for holy days, bribes, or highly offensive body odor. Mornings were not about looking good, they were about being alive and marginally functional. For women, mornings came with additional tasks: grinding grain, milking animals, kneading dough, and attempting to enforce some structure on a household whose primary form of communication was sighing and stepping over each other. Spinning wool or mending clothes often began before breakfast ended, assuming breakfast had not been cancelled due to time constraints or goat interference. Wealthier homes had servants to handle the more unpleasant parts of the morning. Fires were already lit, water was brought, children were dressed. But comfort did not scale perfectly with wealth. Castles were cold, stone did not warm quickly, echoes followed every movement. In many ways, rising in a grand house felt more like waking in a crypt with better furniture. The smell of morning was a layered experience: smoke, wet wool, stale bread, and whatever the goat had decided to knock over. The air inside lingered. Windows were small or non-existent. Airflow was a gamble. If someone burned the porridge, that smell would remain until someone opened the door or a miracle occurred. The first tasks of the day often dictated the tone. If the fire caught quickly, spirits lifted. If the animals behaved, there was a sense of optimism. If the chamber pot tipped during transport, the mood declined sharply. Morning successes were measured in inches: warm hands, dry straw, a complete set of shoes. Breakfast might be shared, it might be eaten in shifts, it might be skipped entirely if the weather had turned, or if work in the fields needed urgent attention. Eating together was not ceremonial, it was logistical. Conversations were brief, instructions were given, food was swallowed with the mechanical speed of people who had things to do and not enough time to do them. For many, the morning routine was also about resetting the household. Fires relit, beds reshaped, floors swept, tools checked, a mental inventory taken. Who was here? Who was sick? Who needed watching? What had broken? What had not? The quiet was used for calculation, not reflection. The morning was the least poetic part of the day, and maybe the most important. By the time the sun was visible, the house had transformed again, from cold, dark hibernation space to active, chaotic organism. The goat had been pushed out the door, the pot was bubbling, the bread was rising, the children were chasing something they should not. The fire was steady. Someone was arguing about chores, someone else was already outside. The world was in motion again, and yet, in all that motion, there was a rhythm. Morning in the 1300s was not relaxing, elegant, or well-scented, but it was routine, it was known. It worked, more or less. It got people from the long night to the longer day. And if the fire held, if the goat stayed outside, if no one dropped the pot, it could even be called a good start. With the sun lifting itself cautiously over the thatched rooftops, the workday began. There were no alarms, no punch clocks, no cheery morning announcements, just the quiet understanding that the moment light touched the frost, everything needed doing. Again. The medieval world did not wait for enthusiasm. It demanded motion. Fields, fires, animals, tools, it all needed tending, and it needed it now. The morning cold lingered stubbornly, especially in winter. Even with the fire going and the bodies up and moving, the chill hung in the air like a guest who refused to leave. Breath fogged in front of mouths, fingers remained stiff, toes took longer to remember they existed. Everyone moved as if trying to outrun the temperature. There was little small talk, only scraping, clanking, and occasional muttered complaints about how someone else did not pull their weight, even though everyone had agreed not to bring that up until at least midday. Outside, the world revealed its tasks. Water needed fetching. The village well, central to survival and rich in rumors, was visited early. Buckets were lowered, drawn, and carried back, often by children, unless the children were pretending to be asleep or had perfected the art of hiding inside sacks. The water was cold, heavy, and sloshed at the slightest provocation. Carrying it without soaking oneself was a local sport with no winners. Fields awaited attention. Whether the soil was frozen, muddy, or merely grudgingly workable, it had to be dealt with. Tools were retrieved, simple things, wooden plows, iron-tipped spades, baskets with more patches than original material. Seeds, if it was that time of year, were counted out like gold. Planting was not casual. It was prayer in motion, a gamble every season. In winter, work shifted indoors. Nets were mended, cloth was woven, tools were sharpened, children were shouted at. If a family owned animals, and most did, they took up much of the morning. Chickens scattered defiantly the moment the door opened. Cows stared blankly and chewed with the indifference of royalty. Pigs made their opinions known loudly. Goats continued their campaign of structured sabotage, milking, feeding, mucking. It was a rotation of predictable effort, occasionally punctuated by surprise childbirth or a sudden escape attempt. The smell of the barn was a force unto itself, earthy, pungent, warm in all the wrong places. There were few breaks. Meals were sometimes brought to the field, sometimes eaten standing, bread, cheese, ale, maybe onions. If one had an especially ambitious morning, a bit of broth. But meals were practical, not inspirational. No one paused to gaze thoughtfully into the horizon while sipping anything. They chewed quickly, muttered something about the weather, and got back to it. Children worked too. As soon as they could walk without falling into fires, they were given tasks: herding geese, fetching eggs, picking weeds, scraping pots. In theory, education existed. In practice, most learning occurred between chores, delivered via stories, threats, or demonstrations involving minor injuries and goats. The line between parenting and apprenticeship was often blurred by necessity and volume. Work was constant but rarely frantic. It unfolded with the pace of experience. People knew what came next. They had done it all before and they would do it again. There was rhythm in repetition: fix the fence, strew the straw, shovel the manure, hammer the wheel, feed the chickens, move the pig, chase the same pig. Apologize to the neighbor about the pig. Then start over. Even homes that looked calm from the outside were orchestras of movement inside. Spinning wheels hummed, pots bubbled, brooms swept, repairs were made, clothes were sewn. Everything within a home demanded constant management. There were no weekends, there were no holidays without chores. Only feast days offered partial relief, and even then, someone had to catch the goose. One lesser-known detail from some regions: ashes from the hearth were collected not just for disposal, but for utility. Mixed with water, they became lye, an essential ingredient for soap. It was not luxury soap. It was soap with ambitions and limited resources. Still, it helped. If someone in the house smelled noticeably less alarming, they were either newly washed or had fallen into the stream. The idea of division between home life and work life did not exist. Work was wherever survival happened. The same hands that kneaded dough also repaired tools. The same room where meals were eaten held drying herbs, stacks of kindling, and occasionally a goose that refused to leave. Boundaries were for castles, villages had corners, weather dictated everything. A sudden rain could cancel field work, a hard frost could delay planting, a warm breeze might mean the entire household shifted priorities, gathering herbs before they wilted or opening the roof hatch to let out the smell of last week's cabbage stew. Everyone watched the sky like it owed them something, and in a way, it did. If a person became ill, the system strained. There were no backup plans. Neighbors might help, if available and inclined. Children might be pressed into more serious duties. Meals became simpler, tempers shorter. Recovery was a luxury. Illness lingered. Some people worked through fevers, others did not recover. The rhythm of the day might pause, but only for a moment. Then the work continued, quieter, warier. Afternoons sometimes allowed for brief rest, especially in warmer months. A nap in the shade, a pause by the fire. These were not indulgences, they were functional survival tactics. 10 minutes of stillness to let the spine straighten and the brain stop listing things to do. But such moments were short, and the list never got shorter. In towns and cities, the noise multiplied. Blacksmiths shouted, vendors barked, horses clattered over stones, dogs barked because everyone else was doing it. Tasks were the same, fetching, carrying, cooking, cleaning. But the backdrop was louder, the work did not differ. Only the density increased. Instead of open fields, people had cramped alleys. Instead of goats wandering into the house, they had goats climbing stairs they were not supposed to climb. One fringe practice worth noting, some households placed small charms or herbs around their tools to prevent theft or misfortune. A sprig of rue, a scrap of cloth with a knot, not magic exactly, just insurance. If the axe kept disappearing, maybe it needed a stern warning, or a string tied around the handle by someone who had reached their limit. Despite everything, people found moments of satisfaction. A well-patched shirt, a loaf of bread that rose properly, a fence that stayed up during the last storm. These were victories, quiet ones. No one clapped, no one gave medals. But someone nodded, someone grunted in approval, and for a moment the world did not seem so unreasonable. Evenings crept in slowly, lengthening shadows across the same paths walked every day. Tools were gathered. Animals were herded inward, fires were fed again. The door was closed, not locked. Most did not have locks, but latched. The home folded back into itself, reshaping around firelight and the anticipation of another long, cold night. Work did not end, it only changed. The same hands that dug in the fields now stirred pots and patched holes. The same voices that argued about pigs now discussed firewood, saints, and someone's increasingly suspicious cough. It was not peace, it was maintenance, and it was enough. By the time dusk arrived, the household was already preparing for another night of uncertain rest. The sun did not set politely. It fell behind the trees with a kind of finality that left no doubt. Daylight was over, and whatever tasks remained would be completed by firelight or not at all. The urgency shifted. The world narrowed to the hearth, the corners of the house, and the quiet shuffling of bodies reclaiming their place in the bed pile. Dinner, if it could be called that, was not a separate event, but an extension of the afternoon's work. Pottage, a thick, boiling mixture of whatever ingredients had survived the week, was the usual fare. Grains, beans, root vegetables, and bits of dried meat or herbs came together in a single, bubbling pot suspended over the fire. Flavor was a secondary concern. Consistency mattered more. If it could stick to the side of a wooden spoon without sliding off immediately, it was ready. Bread, if any remained from earlier in the day, was rationed carefully. Hard crusts were softened in broth. The heel of a loaf might be offered to the oldest or the youngest, depending on who had more leverage. Ale accompanied nearly every meal, not because it tasted good, but because it was safer than water and marginally less likely to give someone dysentery before bedtime. Milk, for those with livestock, was consumed quickly before it could spoil, and often in a state somewhere between fresh and regrettable. Eating was a functional, often silent act. The fire crackled, the wind probed the walls, children fidgeted. Someone coughed ominously and was ignored because there was simply nothing to be done about it that evening. The household ate together, usually in the same space where they slept, worked, and stored everything of value and questionable scent. There were no dining rooms, there were no tablecloths. There were bowls, wooden spoons, and a general understanding that whoever dropped theirs would be mocked well into the next season. Clean-up involved scraping leftovers into the fire, rinsing bowls in whatever water had not frozen solid, and chasing the dog away from the cooking pot. Leftovers were stored in ceramic pots or wrapped in cloth and hung from the rafters, out of reach of rats and other opportunists. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes the cloth sagged just enough to provide a helpful little ladder. Evening tasks followed. Embers were stirred, beds were rearranged, cloaks and blankets were distributed based on a complex household hierarchy involving age, favor, and the ability to steal them back in the middle of the night. Clothes were not changed. That was a luxury. But shoes were removed, mostly to avoid stabbing someone in the leg during sleep, and set near the fire in a hopeful semicircle. Lighting was minimal. Candles, if available, were used sparingly. Most homes relied on the firelight alone. Shadows stretched across the walls, flickering with each gust from the ill-fitted door. The house shrank into itself. Conversation faded. People spoke in whispers, if at all. The noise of the day gave way to the stillness of necessity. Before bed, a few households practiced simple rituals, a quick prayer, a final check that the door was latched, a glance at the rafters to ensure nothing new had taken up residence. In colder months, a rock heated in the fire might be wrapped in cloth and placed near the feet. It did not stay warm for long, but the first few moments were worth it. Most families shared a single sleeping space. Beds, if they existed, were layered with straw, rushes, cloth, and whatever else could insulate against the night. In many homes, there was only one bed frame, or none at all. Sleeping arrangements were practical. Parents in the center, children on the edges, elders in places of honor, if those places also happened to be closest to the fire. Animals slept wherever they pleased. A fringe detail worth noting. In some areas it was believed that placing an iron object near the bed warded off evil spirits. A knife under the mattress, scissors by the door, not for defense necessarily, but for comfort. The idea was not to fight whatever might enter the room, but to convince it to leave quickly and quietly. The act of bedding down was not dramatic. There were no bedtime stories, no lullabies, no pillow fluffing. People collapsed slowly, layer by layer, folding into the warmth of each other and the residual heat of the fire. The room filled with quiet motion, rustling, shifting, sighing. Someone claimed a bit more blanket. Someone else pretended not to notice. In some households, an elder might recite scripture or legends before sleep. These were not soothing bedtime tales. They were moral lessons involving disobedient children, vengeful saints, or peasants who forgot to tithe and were struck by lightning during a wedding. Stories served a purpose. Entertainment was merely an unfortunate side effect. Sleep did not arrive like a curtain. It arrived like fog, slowly, unevenly, settling over the household in patches. Some drifted off immediately. Others lay awake, staring at the beams above, mentally calculating how long it would take the fire to die. Dreams came differently for everyone. Some dreamed of food. Others dreamed of rain. A few dreamed of places they had never been, as if their minds knew about roads their feet would never touch. The fire was the final thing. Someone had to bank it, not let it burn out, but cover it with ash so the embers would survive the night. If done correctly, it would still be warm in the morning. If not, the house would freeze, and someone, usually the youngest, would be sent out to beg a hot coal from a neighbor. Pride did not factor into fire borrowing. Warmth outweighed dignity every time. Banking the fire was both science and superstition. Too much ash, and it smothered. Too little, and it burned out. Some said a prayer while doing it, others sang. A few cursed at it as if fear might make the flame behave. The fire did not respond, it never did. But people kept trying because trying was what people had. In wealthier homes, the bedchamber might be sealed with tapestries or curtains to trap warmth. A servant could be tasked with watching the fire through the night. Some even had hand warmers, ceramic jars filled with hot coals and wrapped in fabric, used to heat bedding. These comforts were rare. Most of the population relied on simpler, itchier solutions: wool, bodies, and grudging proximity. Once the fire was settled, the night belonged to the cold. The rushes on the floor were swept to one side. The goat finally settled down near the door and stopped plotting its next rebellion. The silence deepened. Outside, wind moved through the village, rattling shutters, tugging at thatch, whispering through gaps in the walls. Inside, breathing slowed, bodies stilled. The transition from day to night in the 1300s was not marked by ceremony. It was marked by necessity. Work ended, light faded, the fire was banked, sleep returned. It was a cycle, endless and mostly unremarked except for the rare night when something interrupted it. A storm, a birth, a death. Most nights were the same, and that sameness was a kind of safety. The final sounds of the day were simple: a yawn, a shift of straw, a muffled complaint about someone else's feet. Then silence, deep and wide, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire or the whispered squeak of something small that everyone hoped was just a mouse. And so the house returned to stillness. Not peace exactly, but stillness. Sleep in the 1300s was not luxurious. It was not restful. It was not even guaranteed, but it was essential. And it came, night after night, as reliable as the cold and nearly as welcome. In the towns and villages of the 1300s, not every household ended the day at sunset. Though most commoners aligned their waking hours with the rhythm of the sun, certain people, by choice or profession, stayed awake longer. Bakers, midwives, millers, guards, and brewers often kept late hours, stirring pots, grinding grain, watching fires, or listening for cries in the dark. These were not leisurely activities, they were necessary, and they turned the night into something that still moved, even when most of the village slept. The baker's schedule, for instance, ignored the concept of rest entirely. In order to have bread ready by morning, someone had to rise while others were still mid-snore, fumble toward the oven, and begin preparing dough by lamplight. In towns, this meant communal ovens were in use long before dawn. The aroma of yeast and smoke became a quiet promise drifting through shuttered streets. By the time others woke, the bread would already be browning, and occasionally burning, because even the most diligent baker drifted off sometimes. Baking, in fact, was so important that some towns appointed official bread inspectors to ensure loaves were not underweight. The assize of bread and ale, a real medieval law, regulated quality and pricing. If a baker cheated the weight, he might be fined, publicly shamed, or nailed by the ear to the bakery door. It was a motivational approach to customer service, involving both pain and character development. Brewers, too, often worked late. Ale did not brew itself. It required watching, testing, and careful tending of barrels. In smaller homes, ale was brewed for personal use, but in towns it became a vital part of trade. Since water sources were questionable at best, ale became the default beverage, consumed by adults and children alike. Stronger than water, weaker than wine, and safer than whatever was coming out of the stream behind the tannery, ale was practically medicine. Some even used it as a broth base when vegetables ran short. Nothing said nutrition like onion stew, steeped in half a pint of lukewarm survival. Midwives had their own unpredictable hours. Birth, as it turned out, refused to respect curfews. When labor began, someone ran to fetch the midwife, who arrived with a bag of tools, an iron stomach, and roughly 4 centuries of generational wisdom. Births often took place at night, by firelight, attended by women, whispering prayers or arguing over whose job it was to boil the water. The results varied, survival was not guaranteed, but the midwife stayed, soothed, instructed, and sometimes made quiet decisions no one else wanted to make. The town guard, where one existed, was less romantic. He walked the streets with a lantern and a stick, muttering to himself and occasionally poking suspicious piles of cloth. His job was to watch for fires, thieves, drunks, and anything that might escalate into paperwork. He was rarely paid well. Most carried the vague sense that nothing good ever happened after sunset, and they were not entirely wrong. Meanwhile, inside the homes of merchants and tradespeople, the night brought books, ledgers, and ledgers about books. If someone in the house could read, and that was an achievement, the evening hours were used for record-keeping. A candle was placed in a clay holder, a quill was dipped, fingers cramped, numbers were recorded with painstaking care, and then promptly miscalculated anyway. Among artisans, tools were repaired by firelight, blades sharpened, cloth cut, designs scratched into parchment. The night became a second workspace, quieter and less interrupted. For those with ambition, it was an opportunity. For those with sore backs, it was an obligation. Either way, the hands kept moving. Not all night work was so honest. Some individuals took the cover of darkness as invitation. Poachers crept into forests. Thieves tested locks. Smugglers moved goods past tolls. In port towns, taverns remained open far longer than their legal hours, lit with flickering lanterns and echoing with deals struck over salted fish and lukewarm beer. Gambling, brawling, flirting, often indistinguishable from one another, flourished under the excuse that the sun was no longer watching. A fringe practice, mostly rural, involved something called moon planting. Some farmers believed certain crops grew better when planted at specific moon phases. The full moon, in particular, was said to influence root strength. Whether this was based on observational data or lunar optimism remains debated, but it meant that occasionally entire families found themselves in the fields at night, poking holes in the soil and muttering about turnips. Lighting for all of this was an exercise in compromise. Candles were expensive, tallow smoked and stank. Oil lamps, where available, gave off a dim, flickering glow. Most night work happened near the fire. Shadows danced, tools glinted, people squinted. In some wealthier households, glass lanterns shielded flame from wind. In others, a string was tied to the candle holder to hang from the ceiling, both to light the room and to keep it out of reach of wandering animals or curious toddlers with flammable tendencies. In monasteries, night work was orderly and sacred. Monks rose for vigils, chanting in Latin through clouds of incense. Their schedules, dictated by bells, divided the day into prayer, labor, study, and rest. The night was not exempt. Illuminated manuscripts were sometimes copied by lamplight, each letter drawn with care and a posture that promised spinal regret. The script had to be perfect. Errors meant pages were scraped and rewritten, sometimes more than once. Patience was not optional. The Word of God did not tolerate ink smudges. In these quiet hours, sounds shifted. In villages, the loudness of day faded into the crackle of embers, the creak of beams, the occasional distant howl or church bell. Dogs barked at things no one else could see. Carts rattled down alleys well past reasonable hours. Sometimes a neighbor shouted about something falling. Sometimes no one responded. The night contained its own grammar, short sentences, long silences, and sudden exclamations that made the goat blink. Despite the labor, there was something else present, a sense of ownership. For those awake while others slept, the night belonged to them. It did not offer comfort, but it offered space. Space to think, space to finish what had been rushed earlier, space to exist in relative solitude, even inside a house full of breath and blankets. Of course, the consequences came later. Those who worked late still rose early. There was no cultural allowance for sleeping in. Fatigue accumulated like firewood, stacked, ignored, occasionally catching flame when no one was watching. A merchant who stayed up tallying cloth might still have to escort a shipment at dawn. A midwife who delivered twins at midnight would still need to gather herbs by breakfast. There was no reset button. There was only the next thing. Certain night workers created little systems for rest, brief naps in a chair by the fire, leaning on a sack of grain for 5 minutes, pretending to polish something while actually contemplating their life choices. There were no scheduled breaks, but there were loopholes in reality that tired minds slipped through. Sleep became a trick, not a state. In some homes, older children were deputized to keep watch while adults finished work. These junior assistants were enthusiastic, but distracted easily, and frequently bribed with honeyed bread to stay awake. Their reports were unreliable, their observations dramatic, and their sense of danger often hinged on whether the wind sounded more like a ghost or more like a cow. A few towns organized rotating night watches, neighborhood men taking turns walking the streets, keeping an eye on livestock doors and suspicious rustling. Sometimes these watches fell asleep in the haystack. Sometimes they wandered off for ale. But the idea was there, mutual protection in the hours when the world felt thinnest. The night, in all its flickering complexity, was not idle. It breathed, whispered, worked. While most households slept curled together near the fire, a quiet minority stayed upright, eyes adjusting to the dark, hands busy, minds awake. They were not waiting for the morning. They were carrying the hours forward, one task at a time. Morning had come and gone. Work was in full swing. The fire was steady. The pig had been retrieved from the neighbor's cabbage patch. Bread was cooling, soup was boiling, and somewhere a child was loudly denying responsibility for a mess that had not yet been discovered. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, a moment of quiet expectation fell across the village. Midday rest was near. Not universal, not leisurely, but present. The closest thing most people had to a break. This pause, though brief, mattered. The human body could only shovel, lift, scrub, and argue with livestock for so many hours before beginning to malfunction. Even in the 1300s, when expectations for comfort were criminally low, people needed to stop and breathe. Rest was not about relaxation. It was about recalibration. The tools went down, the pot was stirred, someone sat, someone else leaned against a wall. It was not peace, but it resembled it from a distance. In summer months, rest often occurred outdoors, a tree, a low wall, a shadow stretching across the dirt. These became temporary refuges. People sat wherever they could, chewing bread, sipping ale, or simply blinking at the horizon like it owed them an explanation. In winter, they huddled near the hearth, shoulders tight, hands wrapped around warm mugs. Silence was common. Words were not wasted. Neither was movement. If someone adjusted their position, it was only because part of their body had gone numb. Meals during midday were not elaborate. Bread, again. Cheese, if it had survived the rats. Some dried fruit, perhaps broth, reheated for the third time, and now sporting a mysterious floating herb that no one could identify but everyone pretended was medicinal. Ale was the preferred drink. Water was suspicious. Tea, as it would later be known, had not yet made its presence felt. Coffee was an ocean away. What people had was warmth, calories, and the hope that no one would ask them to stand up for at least 10 minutes. Children were often the least still. While adults collapsed, children took the opportunity to run, chase chickens, argue over pebbles, or invent games involving sticks, mud, and escalating injuries. Occasionally, one would fall asleep mid-motion, face down in the straw, and be left there like a decorative inconvenience. Rest was not equally distributed. It was earned or seized, depending on the personality. In larger households, midday rest became a quiet sort of regrouping. Someone mended a tear, someone else checked the stew. A third person stared into the fire like it owed them something. Conversations happened in low voices. They drifted between weather, harvest, and mild insults about someone's laundry technique. No one expected philosophical revelations. They expected everyone to eat, breathe, and not accidentally knock over the firewood again. In towns, the pause was slightly more structured. Market activity slowed. Tools were downed. Apprentices were granted a sliver of time to stare blankly at a wall before being ordered to fetch something heavy and unnecessary. The bell of a local church might toll the hour, reminding everyone that God was still watching, even if he had a strange sense of humor regarding human comfort. A few brave souls attempted napping. This was not always successful. The noise, the cold, the lumpy straw, and the goat's decision to rearrange the storage baskets made deep rest elusive. But some managed it, curled in corners under benches beside the hearth. If someone snored, it was a sign of victory. If someone drooled, they were declared mayor of the break. A lesser-known practice in certain regions was the use of herbal cushions, small cloth pouches filled with dried lavender, mint, or thyme, placed near the face during rest. These were thought to ease headaches, soothe nerves, and distract from the pervasive smell of wet wool and stale onions. Whether the herbs worked is unclear, but the placebo effect likely had a decent batting average. This was also the hour for quiet repairs. Rope was retied, baskets were reinforced, socks, those rare, precious items, were patched. Most clothing saw heavy use and light maintenance. People mended not to preserve fashion, but to delay replacement. New garments were expensive. A well-patched tunic was a badge of practicality, if not exactly a mark of sophistication. For some, rest meant prayer. A whispered psalm, a finger traced across a splintering crucifix, a nod toward the rafters in case anything was listening. These acts were small, habitual. Faith, like warmth, was measured in increments. A brief glance upward, then back to the bowl. Despite its name, midday rest was rarely restful in the romantic sense. It was not an escape. It was a pivot, a moment to shift from one half of the day into the next. Fatigue did not vanish. It simply became slightly more tolerable. The aches remained. The noise returned. But for a brief spell, the world moved a little slower. When rest ended, it did so without fanfare. Someone stood. Someone else sighed. A child was shaken awake. Tools were lifted. The fire was stoked. The goat, sensing renewed structure, immediately attempted sabotage. The rhythm resumed. It always did. Work did not change much in the afternoon. It just continued. If a fence had been halfway mended before rest, it now reached 3/4. If laundry had been soaking, it was now beaten against a rock with increasing hostility. If someone had dropped a spoon into the cooking pot before resting, they were now trying to retrieve it with a stick and a facial expression that conveyed spiritual defeat. Afternoon light shifted quickly. What began as golden warmth soon turned angled, grey, and sharp. Shadows stretched. Roof lines turned orange, then purple. The chickens, governed by a schedule more ancient than any human plan, began to wander back toward the coop, clucking to themselves like bureaucrats returning from a disappointing conference. In some households, evening preparations began early. The stew was checked again, the fire fed again, blankets shook out, beds poked into shape, cloaks rearranged on hooks or pegs. If the goat was still inside, someone carried it out. If it was already out, someone brought it back in. The goat's agenda remained inscrutable. Children, by this point, began to fade. Their earlier chaos dimmed into dragging feet, louder yawns, and the occasional tantrum regarding whose turn it was to sleep near the fire. Elders became more vocal, usually about how everything had been better, cleaner, or quieter in the previous century. No one believed them, but no one interrupted either. One fringe behavior occasionally noted in household accounts was the evening blowing of horns, not for celebration, but to call home workers still in the fields or woods. These were short, low blasts, sometimes mistaken for animal calls, that echoed across valleys and told someone that the pot was on and their absence was being noticed. It was not particularly romantic, but it was effective. As the final hour of daylight slipped away, the house tilted once again toward night. The cycle resumed, animals fed, beds readied, fire banked. But before all that, there had been this, midday rest, a crack in the wall of endless labor, not wide enough to escape through, but enough to catch a breath, shake out a thought, and briefly, very briefly, feel human. As twilight descended, the village transformed again. The fields darkened, smoke rose steadily from thatched chimneys. Doors were latched with a finality that said nothing more would be attempted today. The world outside faded to a dull hush, broken only by animals bedding down and the occasional cackle from a distant hen who had found the best nesting spot 5 minutes too late. Inside, the household returned to its evening rhythm, familiar, unremarkable, and entirely vital. This was the time for quiet chores, last-minute fixes, and the sacred ritual of pretending the workday had been shorter than it truly was. Rushlights were lit. Shoes were checked for dampness. Someone peered into a pot with the vague hope that food had multiplied since last checked. It had not. Dinner remained a variation of the previous meal, warm, lumpy, and full of personality. There were no new ingredients. There were only new excuses. Evening meals were not social events. They were structural necessities. The same bread, the same stew. Occasionally, someone offered a suggestion, more salt, less turnip, fewer bones next time, but such feedback was rarely rewarded. Conversation remained minimal, drifting between weather complaints and brief disputes about who had left the door open during the last frost. Firelight dominated the space. It shaped the mood. Shadows flickered across the beams. Faces glowed with the same red-gold hue as the inside of the pot. No one moved far from the hearth unless required. Even the goat, if present indoors, arranged itself into a semicircle near the warmth, half asleep and entirely indifferent to domestic politics. For children, this was the hour of slipperiness, tasks forgotten, socks misplaced, unresolved squabbles reignited in the corner. An adult, exhausted beyond articulation, might bark an order that contained no verbs, only pointed gestures and a low growl. Children obeyed eventually, often after being physically relocated. Older members of the household grew quieter. Some mended garments, slowly, and with the resigned intensity of those who knew the seam would unravel again tomorrow. Others poked at their feet, inspecting blisters or wiping off traces of the day's more treacherous activities. A few leaned back and stared into the fire, trying to remember if it was Tuesday, or if that had already happened this week. In many homes, this was the only time available for small luxuries, combing hair, oiling boots, or reheating a stone for placing at the foot of the bed. These gestures were not for indulgence. They were to avoid disaster. A misaligned boot led to a limp. An unwatched ember led to a hole in the bedding. Prevention was more restful than cure. The fire needed constant maintenance. It was never left alone. Ash was stirred. Wood was added. Someone crouched nearby, holding a stick like a scepter, issuing subtle threats to the flame. In some households, there was a fire turn, a rotational duty, often dreaded, that ensured the embers would survive into morning. Forgetting the fire turn led to frostbitten toes and recriminations that echoed well past sunrise. Stories were sometimes told in this hour, not fairy tales, but practical warnings dressed in metaphor. The girl who stepped in the well, the boy who disobeyed and was chased by a talking pig. Cautionary tales carried forward by memory and repetition, trimmed of wonder and sharpened for effectiveness. Laughter occurred, but quietly, like it had been rationed. One curious detail, some medieval families kept tokens near the hearth, small figurines, blessed herbs, or bits of old cloth wrapped around a nail. These were not decorations, they were protective symbols meant to guard against spirits, bad dreams, and that specific cousin who always brought drama. Whether they worked was unknown, but removing them was not advised. In wealthier homes, evening involved a little more ceremony. A servant might pour warm water for washing. Beds might be fluffed. Slippers appeared, brought in from where they had been airing out in the hallway. Guests, if present, were offered the best stool and a share of the thicker end of the pottage. Conversation remained restrained unless wine had appeared, at which point someone might recite a poem, and someone else would sigh loudly and pretend to admire it. Literacy, where it existed, sometimes changed the tone. A few could read aloud, psalms, prayers, popular romances about knights who made poor decisions and were then surprised when things escalated. Pages turned slowly. Light was dim. The reader's voice rose and fell, and even those who could not follow the words listened anyway, because voices, unlike goats, could be calming. Even in more ordinary households, a kind of stillness emerged. Chores finished, food eaten, children quieted. Outside, the wind sharpened. Inside, bodies sagged toward the bedding. The fire snapped once, loudly, and everyone flinched, except for the oldest person in the room, who had heard louder things on quieter nights. Clothing for sleep was whatever had survived the day. There were no nightgowns, only tunics, slightly less filthy than the others. Layers were added. Hats were pulled low. If someone removed their belt, it was not for comfort, but because it had started leaving marks. Straw was fluffed, blankets were rearranged, feet were tucked under anything warm. The pile began to take shape. Sleep approached unevenly. Some dropped into it like stones into a pond. Others lingered, eyes half open, staring at the rafters and listening to the night breathe. It was not quiet. Mice scratched, beams creaked, a dog howled in the distance, and someone, half asleep, whispered that it was an omen, then immediately began snoring. People spoke little in these last moments. A muttered complaint. a whispered prayer. The sound of someone attempting to move silently and failing completely. The household shifted toward stillness, dragging its remaining thoughts into dreams. It was not serenity, it was necessity. And that was often enough. A fringe belief persisted in parts of Europe that bad dreams could be prevented by placing a bowl of water under the bed. The water, it was said, absorbed evil, or confused the spirit trying to enter, or made the floor too slippery for mischief. The explanations varied, the bowl remained. Occasionally, someone kicked it over in the night and blamed it on demons. In certain rural areas, evening involved an extra ritual, tossing a handful of salt over the threshold, not for seasoning, for luck or protection, or because someone's great-grandmother said it should be done and no one felt brave enough to stop doing it. Tradition and suspicion often looked identical after dark. The final act of the evening was the fire banking. Ash was heaped over the coals. The light dimmed. Someone adjusted the blanket over the baby. Someone else repositioned the family's least cooperative leg. Then, with no announcement, the house fell into its first sleep. Not deep, not undisturbed, but present. Outside, the village darkened, no lamps in windows, no movement in alleys, only smoke rising and the wind pressing gently at shutters. Inside, breath slowed, heat faded, and the world paused again. Sometime after midnight, the house stirred, not with purpose, not with clarity, just enough to remind everyone that sleep in the 1300s did not come all at once or stay all the way through. This was the hour of segmented slumber, the gap between the first and second sleep. The first sleep had ended without ceremony. Perhaps someone rolled over, perhaps someone coughed, perhaps a dog barked at the wind again, and no one was sure if it was the same wind as earlier. Whatever the cause, the waking was not jarring. It was familiar, expected. In medieval life, sleeping in 2 shifts was not unusual. It was the default. Historians still argue whether the split sleep arose from practical necessity or natural rhythm. Either way, it seemed to work. People fell asleep shortly after sundown, woke around midnight, remained awake for an hour or 2, then returned to bed. This interlude was sometimes called the watch, which sounded far more intentional than it usually was. During the watch, people did what people always do when sleep deserts them. They stirred the fire, they visited the chamber pot, they whispered to one another too quietly for goats or children to overhear. In some households, it was the only time a couple had to speak without interruption or assignment. These moments were private and strange, part memory, part dream. Lighting was minimal. A single candle, maybe. Embers, mostly. Those who moved about did so by memory and toe injuries. Voices stayed low. The walls of medieval homes were not thick, and privacy was mostly theoretical. Still, something about the watch made people feel wrapped in a separate time, unmeasured by tools or tasks. Prayer was common during this interval. The hours of night were thought to be sacred, dangerous, or both. Certain monastic traditions marked these hours with chanting. Peasants marked them with muttering and the hope that no one would knock on the door with bad news. It was a time for quiet reflection, or mild complaints about straw in one's ear. Some took this time to check on livestock. A cow might be close to calving. A goat might be missing. Chickens might be arguing with a mouse. Walking outside was risky. The cold was sharp, and spirits, according to rumor, walked freely in the blue hours. Still, necessities overruled superstition. Boots were pulled on, doors were opened, the night inhaled. There were practical uses for the wakeful hour. Nets were mended, bread was kneaded, wounds were inspected by firelight, as if scolding them would accelerate healing. For those who had the rare gift of literacy, this was the best time to read, quiet, still, and uninterrupted by requests to carry something heavy. In towns, the second sleep period was even more irregular. Some homes never quite settled after midnight. Inns stayed noisy. Streets held pockets of activity. Thieves preferred this stretch. People asleep enough to be slow, awake enough to be unaware. Watchmen muttered to each other about lantern oil and the unnatural behavior of cats. One odd belief from the period held that the time between sleeps was ideal for conception. This was not based on any scientific understanding, but on the assumption that the body had been reset by the first rest and was therefore more receptive. Whether this held any truth is unknown, but the claim appeared often enough in medical texts to be noticed and quietly judged. The transition between the two sleeps was rarely dramatic. One moment, a person might be mending a sock. The next, they were snoring into it. Sleep returned slowly, like fog crawling back into a valley. No one signaled the second shift. It simply happened. The fire settled, the air cooled, straw rustled, silence resumed. This sleep, the second one, often held deeper dreams. The first sleep burned off the day. The second explored stranger places. People reported visions, visitations, and revelations. A few believed these dreams carried messages, divine, ancestral, or herbal in origin. More likely, they were a result of eating stew with too many unknown ingredients. The second sleep usually lasted until dawn. Its quality depended on luck, the weather, and the behavior of everyone else sharing the bedding. Kicks, snorts, sudden shouts, all were common. No one apologized in the morning. Everyone was too tired to remember, and if they did remember, they pretended otherwise. Peace was easier when selective amnesia was mutual. Some households adapted this pattern more rigidly. They set aside a log or a special pillow for the waking seat, reserved for the person who would tend the fire or listen for odd noises. This was not a position of honor. It was a form of preventative maintenance. The person on watch rarely made it through the entire interval without nodding off, but the illusion of vigilance satisfied the household. Others simply accepted that someone would always be awake. An elder, a restless child, a person with a sore back. The night was never truly silent. Snoring harmonized with the creak of beams. Dogs growled in their sleep. Rain tapped. Mice squeaked. The world breathed. One superstition claimed that whispering someone's name during the watch could bring them dreams of you. Whether this was used for romance, mischief, or revenge is unclear. The more pressing concern was whether anyone could be heard whispering in the first place, since entire families slept inches apart. If the whisperer succeeded, they were probably awarded a medal made of bad judgment. In some villages, the watch became an unofficial hour for storytelling. Grandparents whispered to grandchildren tales of saints, sinners, and suspiciously talkative animals. These stories were brief, likely recycled, and ended abruptly if the child fell asleep halfway through, which was considered the optimal result. A fringe practice involved placing iron objects at the foot of the bedding during this interval, not for protection against bandits, but against fey creatures, wandering spirits, or whatever else might slip through the cracks in a poorly sealed door. An iron knife, a scissor, a horseshoe, anything dense and rust-prone. The logic was simple. Steel scared things. Whether this deterred spirits or simply added bruises to an already stiff population is unclear. By the time the second sleep reached its end, the fire had died down again. The air turned crisp, breath fogged slightly above blankets, light crept in through gaps in shutters. Somewhere, a rooster betrayed the entire concept of tranquility. People stirred. There was no alarm, no rooster-shaped clock. The return to waking life was gentle for some, abrupt for others. Someone's bladder made the decision. Someone else's dream concluded with a jolt. A child rolled off the bedding and announced it was morning. Technically, it was not. But trying to explain that to a child in the 1300s was just as pointless as trying today. A few ambitious souls used the final moments before full dawn to finish small tasks, threading a needle, stretching a sore shoulder, staring into the hearth like it might offer life advice. These were gestures, not accomplishments. But in a world that never stopped moving, gestures counted for something. With the new day beginning, the rhythm repeated itself. First sleep, wakeful hour, second sleep, then noise, light, fire, motion. Everything continued. There was comfort in the pattern, not restfulness necessarily, but rhythm. And that rhythm, flawed as it was, kept people from losing track of themselves. Split sleep eventually faded from common practice, replaced by consolidated rest, as artificial lighting extended the day and changed how time was lived. But in the 1300s, this double sleep structure was normal, accepted, almost unnoticed. Night was not one block of unconsciousness. It was an intermission, a breath, a fold in the fabric of time. As people rose, rubbing eyes and muttering about how fast the fire had gone cold, no one discussed the watch. No one declared how they had used their wakeful hour. It belonged to the dark, a personal space within a communal life, brief, quiet, and utterly human. Waking up in the 1300s was not a graceful affair. There were no soft alarms, no steaming mugs, and certainly no gentle piano melodies to greet the dawn. Instead, there was stiffness, cold, and the immediate awareness that something sharp had been dug into one's side for most of the night. Whether that something was straw, a sibling's elbow, or a goat's hoof was largely irrelevant. The day had begun, and the floor was unforgiving. The first sound in many homes was not a rooster. It was coughing, loud, deliberate, competitive coughing, as if each member of the household needed to declare they had survived another night. After that came rustling, scraping, and the traditional early morning negotiation over whose turn it was to check the fire. No one volunteered. Someone always lost. Rekindling the hearth was a critical ritual. If the embers had survived the night, congratulations, someone had banked the fire properly. If not, someone, often the youngest, or slowest to pretend they were asleep, was sent to the neighbor's house to beg a coal. This small shame walk, complete with clay pot and frozen toes, was a common part of village life. The phrase, "let the fire die," was not a metaphor. It was an accusation. Once the fire caught, the room came back to life. Breath ceased to fog. Water buckets were checked, usually frozen. A pot was placed on the hook to warm breakfast, which would be indistinguishable from dinner, which had not been very different from lunch. Someone stirred something, someone else groaned while trying to locate a missing boot. A third individual, usually unnoticed, was already sweeping the hearth as if they had slept through a more dignified era. The order of rising was determined by proximity to the fire, social hierarchy, and who had rolled off the bedding first. Elders moved slowest. Children were carried or threatened upright. Adults stretched, scratched, yawned, and said nothing because words were expensive in the first hour and often wasted on complaints that no one intended to fix. Clothing remained unchanged unless the existing layer had developed holes large enough to become inconvenient. A fresh tunic was a special event. A washed one was nearly scandalous. Most garments were brushed off, retied, and pulled into approximate alignment. Laces were knotted, cloaks were thrown on, belts were tightened until circulation resumed. If a person's outfit smelled less offensive than yesterday, it was considered a win. Hygiene, such as it was, came next. Hands and faces were rinsed in cold water that inspired spiritual reflection. Teeth, if acknowledged at all, were wiped with cloth or rubbed with sage or salt. No one smiled during this process. It was not for appearance. It was to prevent the slow march of rot from claiming another molar before Lent. Mouths were sometimes rinsed with wine if water tasted questionable, which, in fairness, was nearly always. Latrines, when available, were grim. Wooden seats over pits, some lined with straw. Most shared with spiders, frost, and a level of smell that had achieved independent consciousness. Chamber pots, emptied at sunrise, were carried outside with solemnity and held at arm's length. No one made eye contact with a neighbor during this task. Everyone understood. Some households had specific routes for dumping, so the splash zone did not overlap with the laundry area, an innovation born of experience. Not every home had a dedicated latrine. Some used the edge of the property, some used buckets, a few had small, awkward shelters called garderobes, which doubled as cold weather tests of character. These were often attached to the outer wall, so the waste fell directly into the moat or alley below. It was efficient, if not celebrated. Children occasionally leaned too far and were yanked back by their collars while being told stories about the unfortunate neighbor who had not been so lucky. Shoes were laced, cloaks were fastened, tools were retrieved from corners where they had been dropped the previous night. Children were sent to collect eggs, haul water, or bother someone else's livestock. Breakfast was eaten standing, or not at all. Bread in one hand, half-silent argument in the other. Occasionally, someone attempted to eat while walking and was immediately reprimanded for such reckless behavior. In towns, the morning brought sound. Bells rang, doors opened, merchants emerged with carts. Apprentices ran, late for something they did not understand. The streets filled slowly, mud, boots, chickens, and muttered curses all returning to their natural habitats. Everything smelled of ash, hay, and someone else's stew. Rural homes began slower, but moved longer. Livestock needed feeding, fences were checked, tools were assessed for splinters or dents. The chores were endless, mostly identical and rarely celebrated, but they kept the household fed, clothed, and only moderately at odds with gravity. One documented fringe practice found in parts of northern Europe involved greeting the morning sun with a handful of grain tossed eastward. It was meant to honor the day's return and confuse evil spirits, who were apparently bad, with directions. Some families also marked the first egg, laid each day with a small chalk mark for luck. These traditions faded with time, but were sincere while they lasted. Weather dictated much. A clear sky meant outdoor work. A grey one meant mud, complaints, and indoor tasks that involved tools no one liked. Rain shifted everything. It made the inside of homes darker, colder, and louder. Thatched roofs, while excellent at shedding water, were less excellent at staying quiet. The sound of rain on thatch was either comforting or maddening, depending on whether the hole above one's head had been patched properly. Winter mornings required more coordination. Extra wood needed hauling. Boots took longer to thaw. Fingers refused to grip anything until coaxed back to life near the fire. A person could spend 20 minutes trying to tie a shoelace while swearing softly at frost and fate. Gloves existed, but rarely matched and often resembled two mittens that had recently escaped a compost pile. The morning passed without pause. There was no mid-morning tea, no second breakfast, and certainly no time to sit and contemplate the meaning of one's chores. One simply worked until the sun shifted. Children might sneak a bite of something while pretending to look busy. Adults muttered through task lists only they could decipher. Elders provided commentary from whatever seat had the best view and the least exposure to drafts. If a visitor arrived early, it disrupted everything. Hosts scrambled to look as though they had been prepared. A cloth was thrown over something, a chair was offered. If the visitor brought news, it was usually bad. If they brought nothing, they stayed too long. Hospitality was sacred, but patience was mortal. Noise rose gradually. Hammers struck wood. Hooves clattered. Someone shouted that the bucket had split again. The rhythm of daily life grew steadier, louder, and more absurd. In the midst of it all, someone always asked where the other shoe had gone. It had not gone anywhere. It was under the cloak next to the spoon. The first hour after waking was not magical. It was cold, loud, and crowded. But it was also ordinary, and that made it tolerable. When everything was unpredictable, weather, crops, illness, goats, a predictable morning was a kind of gift. No ribbons, no music, just breath in cold air, and the knowledge that the fire was still burning. And in the corner of the room, someone quietly banked a small ember for the next night, because it would come again, because the same motions would be needed again, and because even the most exhausted hands knew the shape of survival. By late morning, the village was fully awake. The mud had thickened, the smoke had settled, the chickens were now trespassing confidently across property lines, and someone, somewhere, was already shouting about it. The day had found its rhythm, and that rhythm involved more repetition than innovation. This was the part of the day where tasks stopped being interesting and started being necessary. Fields had to be tended, fences had to be fixed. Cloth needed mending, carts needed wheel checks, and no one seemed to know what had happened to the soapstone again. Everyone had work, and everyone knew exactly how much of it they would rather not be doing. In agricultural households, the work focused on survival by way of dirt, digging, sowing, weeding, turning compost, carrying manure from one corner of the world to another with the kind of grim dedication that only centuries of repetition could produce. Hands blistered, backs ached, shoes squelched. Occasionally, someone muttered about becoming a monk. Children had their own assignments, not formal jobs, but clusters of small responsibilities delivered with an implied threat. Watching geese, gathering firewood, carrying water without dropping it, fetching things from the neighbor's barn without being distracted by whatever scandal was currently unfolding there. Children were both useful and unreliable, capable of real help and also completely derailed by shiny rocks. Spinning and weaving dominated female labor in many homes, especially outside planting and harvest seasons. The household spindle rarely rested. Thread was drawn and twisted with a rhythm as old as myth. It was not glamorous, it was not optional. Cloth needed to be made, and even the roughest garments required hours of preparation. If the result resembled something wearable, that was called success. In some households, a second fire was lit closer to midday to heat water for washing clothes or bodies. Washing either was an act of courage, water was cold, soap, when it existed, was harsh, and privacy was aspirational at best. People washed quickly, strategically, and with the sort of discretion that came from years of pretending the curtain actually worked. Tradespeople set out into towns or along roads with tools and samples. The blacksmith needed commissions, the potter needed customers, the thatcher needed someone with a roof on the verge of collapse and poor impulse control. These interactions were brief. Coins were counted twice. Work was promised. Reputation carried more weight than ink. In rural settings, news traveled slowly, but gossip sprinted. A goat that escaped yesterday was already being described today as a devil in the form of livestock. Someone's cart broke in a ditch, and by noon it had become a tale involving sabotage, divine punishment, and possibly a haunting. Oral tradition worked fast, especially when the truth was inconvenient. Lunch was not a pause, it was an overlap. People ate while working or standing or walking, more bread, a few greens, maybe some leftover stew from the night before, now congealed into something that could legally be called a wall. Ale washed it down. Talking occurred, but mostly in fragments and with full mouths. Among the elderly, the middle part of the day brought reflection or commentary. One sat, one muttered, one pointed at a crack in the wall and began a story no one asked for. It was not disrespect. It was ambient wisdom, background sound that filled the silence between hoofbeats and hammer strikes. Fringe beliefs thrived in this part of the day, when the sun was high and odd occurrences could be seen clearly. In some areas, it was believed that if a bird landed on a windowsill during midday, it carried a message. This message was rarely good: death, illness, or marriage, none of which people particularly wanted that week. In monasteries, late morning and early afternoon followed a different order. Bells marked the passing hours, psalms were sung, pages turned. In the scriptorium, quills scratched across vellum with the seriousness of 1,000 unpaid interns. Every letter mattered, every blot was a setback. Discipline and ink ruled the day, and elbows were never allowed on the desk. In towns, noise ruled the streets. Vendors called out, apprentices fumbled deliveries, bakers adjusted loaves in ovens while pretending to remember which ones belonged to which customer. The air carried the scent of yeast, sweat, and whatever someone had spilled in the alley. A cart broke a wheel, a dog stole a sausage, a child claimed innocence. The pattern repeated. One fringe trade that emerged in this time was known as the bone collector. Not metaphorical, actual bones, cleaned, sorted, and repurposed for buttons, tools, or sometimes mysterious art projects that everyone agreed not to ask about. These tradespeople roamed the outskirts of towns, pulling useful fragments from places no one wanted to go. They were not popular, but they were necessary, like mold or tax collectors. Back in the countryside, weather continued to dictate the pace. Clouds rolled in. The wind shifted. Someone mentioned rain with the same tone one might use to announce a siege. Laundry was rushed indoors. Tools were covered. Animals were rounded up. If nothing happened, complaints were issued about the forecast being unreliable. Children returned from errands with stories instead of items. A cat had chased a chicken. A neighbor had fallen in the stream. Someone claimed to have seen a ghost near the well again. Adults nodded, vaguely impressed, but still asked where the bucket was. The bucket had been forgotten, but the story would survive for weeks. Tasks layered upon each other with a kind of mechanical inevitability. If the fence was fixed, the gate would need patching. If the herbs were gathered, they would need sorting. If the bucket was found, it would be leaking. Nothing ended. Everything continued. It was not so much a list as a spiral. Animal care filled the gaps. Pigs were fed. Sheep were counted. Chickens were accused of wrongdoing and denied it loudly. The rooster strutted as if responsible for all life, while ducks plotted their usual escape. No one trusted ducks. They were too quiet when they were planning something. In many households, afternoon also meant preparation for evening. Dough was kneaded for the night's bread, beans were sorted, herbs were dried and hung, candles were checked. If wax was low, someone would be sent to barter for more, armed with dried apples and false optimism. In wealthier homes, tutors arrived to instruct children in Latin, manners, and how not to embarrass their family lineage. Lessons were brief, often interrupted by chickens, and concluded with the tutor wondering whether this had all been a mistake. Children, as always, learned best by eavesdropping. In the fields, workers moved in patterns that defied the clock, but made perfect sense to their bodies. A rhythm emerged: scythe, bundle, stack, repeat. In vineyards, clusters were picked, with fingers stained and knuckles scratched. No one called it sacred, they called it work. A few believed that if a horse sneezed precisely at noon, it foretold company by sunset. This prophecy was neither reliable nor helpful, but it gave people something to argue about when the horse was clearly just allergic to hay. Nevertheless, if someone did arrive, the horse was praised for its mysterious wisdom. Eventually, carts returned, wood was unloaded, tools were stored, boots were stomped at the threshold. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to pull the day toward its end. People straightened their backs, wiped hands on aprons, and stared briefly at the sky, wondering whether they had accomplished anything at all. They had. They just could not tell because everything still looked exactly the same. Afternoon slid into evening with the stealth of a fox, or perhaps just with the weight of another endless day. The sky shifted hue. The wind grew lazy. Shadows stretched as if reaching for some excuse to end the day early. No one announced that evening had begun, but everyone recognized the signs. Tools were leaned against walls. Aprons were shaken out. Someone finally remembered the bucket. The rhythm of the village slowed but did not stop. It merely changed tempo. This was the hour of preparation for cessation. The world did not rest yet, but it began looking for a bench. Evening brought its own series of labors, mostly indoors. The outdoor tasks had dwindled with the light, but indoors there remained plenty to do. A stew needed tending, a cloth needed patching, a sibling dispute over who had ruined the firewood pile needed judging. No one admitted guilt, and no one was innocent. For many families, this was the time for second chores, those odd duties that had no obvious place in the rest of the day. Replacing the rushes on the floor, sharpening a tool, peering at a hinge, and pretending one understood hinges. Someone might suddenly remember that the door had not latched properly for 6 months and declare it a crisis. It would not be fixed, but it would be discussed. In wealthier homes, the shift was marked with ceremony. Candles were lit, robes were changed, tables were laid with bread, cheese, something pickled, and an air of mild formality. Guests, if present, were expected to comment on the flavor of the bread, even if the bread had no flavor beyond slightly burned. Among peasants, the line between evening and night was thinner. Dinner was served from the same pot that had held lunch. The table, if one existed, was not cleared, merely nudged to one side to make space for feet. Children gathered near the hearth. Elders stayed seated where they had been all afternoon, unwilling to shift a bone that had finally stopped aching. The food itself was not glamorous. Pottage, hard bread, maybe onions. Always the suspicion that someone had added turnip again, despite repeated protests. Everyone ate. No one applauded. The meal ended when the pot was empty or someone yelled about it being bedtime. That was the cue. Evening was a time of overlap. Work and rest. Light and dark. Noise and hush. It was also when conversation, long withheld, attempted to stretch its legs. People spoke more freely, not loudly, not about feelings, but about tools, weather, and who had been seen limping near the tavern. Someone always had a theory, and someone else always had a reason why that theory was nonsense. This was the hour when stories returned, cautionary tales, family legends, descriptions of dreams that had made no sense but had somehow involved fire, geese, and a distant uncle. These were shared quietly near the hearth. The fire snapped. The dog twitched. A child fell asleep mid-sentence and was gently covered with whatever fabric was not currently in use. Some homes performed small rituals at this time. A coin hidden under the threshold. A prayer said toward the east. A broom placed bristles up to keep misfortune from entering. These actions were not questioned, they were repeated like breathing. Not because they always worked, but because skipping them felt like inviting trouble. In areas near forests, it was common to bar the door more than once. Not because of wolves, although wolves were a possibility, but because night belonged to other things. Spirits, thieves. wind that whispered too deliberately. Doors were secured, shutters closed, and any open gap stuffed with cloth or, failing that, with passive hope. Washing occurred if there was time and water, faces and hands mostly, feet if one had been lucky enough to avoid mud. Anything more was considered extravagant. Hair was combed, but never discussed. No one boasted about personal grooming. If someone looked clean, it was attributed to lighting. Evening was also when minor repairs took place. The spindle was checked, the knife was honed, a bucket was turned upside down and stared at until someone remembered why it was leaking. The leaking was not fixed, but the memory was satisfying. One had identified the problem. Progress. The fire by now was the central figure in the room. It lit everything. It warmed everything. It listened to everything and interrupted no one. People faced it instinctively like plants turning toward the sun. The fire knew who had complained about dinner, and it forgave everyone. Some households had a special stone, heated near the hearth and placed under the bed. It did not stay warm for long, but for those first 5 minutes it was magic. Others relied on furs or the warmth of proximity. Sleep was not about comfort, it was about warmth, habit, and whoever claimed the best corner first. Evening sounds were different. The creak of wood, the settling of walls, the sigh of straw shifting under weight. Sometimes a barn door thudded in the wind. Sometimes a chicken made a poor decision. People listened, not with alarm, but with familiarity. These were the expected complaints of a structure that had survived another day. One fringe belief, found in certain areas, claimed that whistling indoors after dark invited misfortune. Specifically, it attracted wandering spirits, jealous ghosts, or bored ancestors. Whether this was true mattered less than the fact that no one wanted to test it. Whistling after dinner was considered unwise unless one truly disliked everyone in the room. For children, this was when energy surged for no reason. One began building something with sticks. Another declared they had seen a rat or a dream, or a rat in a dream. Parents intervened with efficiency, redirecting chaos with threats, bribes, or a sudden assignment to rearrange the firewood. Outside, the sky turned iron. Stars appeared reluctantly. The moon, if present, was greeted with suspicion or awe depending on its size and color. Owls called, dogs answered. Somewhere down the lane, someone began singing off-key and was quickly encouraged to stop by the collective will of everyone with ears. Inside, the pace slowed. Voices dropped, movements softened. No one declared bedtime, but it became apparent. The youngest fell asleep first, then the dog, then the middle child, who had spent the afternoon chasing geese. Adults lingered. A few poked at the fire one last time. Someone set aside their spindle. Someone adjusted a blanket. Evening was not an ending, it was a narrowing. The room shrank. The world outside disappeared behind shutters. People leaned into the space around them. The day had been long. The next one would be longer. But for now, the air was still. The fire was low. And someone, finally, remembered to put the bucket outside. In some parts of the countryside, families would quietly sing short evening songs, not ballads or hymns, just a few lines repeated under breath while brushing hands against fabric. These songs had no known author. They were passed down like spoons or burn scars. The words did not matter. The melody mattered. It made the room feel slightly less like a roofed box and slightly more like home. The final duties were often the most sacred. A latch checked one more time. A glance at the sky. A quiet promise made to oneself to do better tomorrow. Sharpen the blade, feed the chickens earlier, scold fewer children, or at least remember to patch that hole in the wall. These were promises with poor track records, but making them helped. Some elders said the fire should never be allowed to die completely overnight, even in summer. It was not superstition, it was strategy. Relighting from nothing was hard, frustrating, and humiliating if the neighbor was involved. Embers were banked under ash. A stick was set beside the hearth. A plan was made. By the time sleep approached, no one bothered to say anything poetic. No one looked around and offered a speech about gratitude. People simply lay down, not because they had finished, but because they had paused. That was enough. Night in the 1300s did not fall. It gathered, slowly, deliberately, like a thick cloak being draped across the landscape. The last smudge of light faded behind crooked rooftops, and the world surrendered itself to flickering hearths, guttering candles, and the kind of darkness that made every sound feel closer than it ought to be. This was not the hour of action, it was the hour of adjustment. The tasks were over, the chatter had dulled, and most limbs had accepted defeat. A few remained upright, poking at embers, folding wool, or brushing crumbs off a bench. But for the majority, this was the time to lie down, stare into nothing, and ignore the argument unfolding between two mice under the cupboard. In most homes, sleeping arrangements were not strategic, they were inevitable. Families slept together, often in the same bed, sometimes on straw mattresses laid in sequence like livestock puzzles. The idea of personal space did not exist. If someone shifted, everyone noticed. If someone snored, everyone judged silently. Elbows were shared, blankets were not. Positioning mattered. Those closest to the fire were considered fortunate, unless the fire sparked, in which case they were considered flammable. The outermost sleeper risked exposure to cold drafts, animal paws, or sudden questions from children with active imaginations. Parents developed a sixth sense for incoming limbs. One eye remained half open out of habit. Pillows were rare and inconsistent. A folded cloak, a sack of something soft adjacent, occasionally a pet with poor boundaries. Beds were straw-stuffed sacks, wood platforms, or simply a tightly packed corner. Wealthier families might possess a proper frame, complete with ropes that needed tightening, hence the phrase about sleeping tight. It was more chore than luxury. Silence took time to settle. Someone always remembered one more thing, usually a complaint or a riddle. Then came the shuffles, the groans, the reminder that feet should not be placed against one's sibling's spine. Eventually the noise thinned. Breathing deepened, shadows lengthened. The house began to hold its breath. In the larger towns, night activity did not cease entirely. Inns remained open, lanterns swung from doorposts, watchmen patrolled with staffs and half-bored expressions. The distant sound of a lute might drift through alleyways, followed by equally distant shouting. Somewhere, someone knocked over something made of clay. No one cleaned it up. For those still awake, night offered a strange clarity. The dark removed distraction. It narrowed vision. A person could sit near the coals, stare at nothing, and feel as though they had solved something without knowing the question. This sensation lasted until someone sneezed or the dog twitched violently in its sleep. Certain beliefs were tied to the middle of the night. Some feared dreams that occurred past midnight, believing them to carry heavier meaning. Others welcomed them, claiming these were the dreams in which ancestors whispered warnings or recipes. Dream interpretation was a thriving household sport, second only to arguing over whose turn it was to empty the chamber pot. Among the nobility, sleep rituals had their own flair. Tapestries were drawn, cushions fluffed, curtains closed, bedchambers were cooled or warmed depending on the season. Servants whispered, dogs lounged at the foot of the bed with the self-importance of furniture. Books were read aloud until the reader slurred into slumber. For peasants, the evening's pageantry involved hoping no one kicked over the water bucket in the dark. Everything else was left where it had been dropped. If someone woke up thirsty, they drank from the same jug as everyone else. If someone needed the latrine, they tried not to wake the household or the goats. Usually one or the other objected. There was little privacy, but there was shared stillness. When everything else had quieted, no tools, no shouting, no demands, there was space for thoughts to become almost audible. People remembered odd things at this hour, the way someone had looked at market, the moment a cartwheel had groaned louder than expected, the face of a sibling long gone, or the exact place they had hidden last summer's apple. Some whispered prayers, some counted the number of cracks in the ceiling, some simply watched the flickering light on the wall and waited for dreams. There was no pressure to fall asleep quickly. Time no longer moved on a schedule. It meandered. It floated like smoke from the last burning stick. One fringe belief advised against sleeping with both hands above the blankets. It was said to invite the attention of witches who mistook it for an invitation to meddle. Others insisted that iron placed beneath the bed warded off nightmares, toothaches, or ungrateful spirits. Whether these rituals worked was irrelevant. People practiced them because one never wanted to be the exception on a cursed morning. Coughs echoed more loudly at night. So did whispers. So did creaks. If a child cried, someone reached out and patted the air until they found the right head. If an adult groaned, no one asked questions unless it continued for more than 2 nights. Repeating discomfort meant trouble. Single night groans were simply part of the ambience. In monasteries, the night hours were marked by bells and chanting. The monks rose at odd intervals for prayers, psalms, and reflections. They walked softly. They spoke rarely. Their nights were regimented, sacred, and filled with candlelight. While the rest of the world slept through its aches, these figures drifted like ghosts through stone corridors, chasing spiritual clarity and warmth from insufficient wool. Back in the common home, night thickened. The fire dimmed to embers. Every shift in bedding released a puff of straw or a muttered curse. Someone dreamed aloud about turnips. Someone else muttered about chickens. No one responded. It was not always a peaceful rest. The second sleep had its own troubles. The air was colder. The dreams were stranger. Rats were more confident. A squeak in the corner could cause 3 people to sit up and argue whether it was a rat, a ghost, or a rat with ghost-like intentions. Eventually, they all gave up and pulled the blankets higher. Some families kept a candle lit all night, its flame no bigger than a bee's sigh. Others relied on the glow of coals or the light of the moon. Night was not completely dark. It was layered. Light came in threads. It slipped through cracks and under doors. It traced silhouettes on faces too tired to notice. In some regions, it was common to wake up fully during the night, sometimes for an hour or 2. This was not insomnia, it was just how things were. Historians now refer to this as segmented sleep, a first and second phase with a quiet wakefulness between them. People prayed, stirred the fire, or chatted in low voices. Some even visited neighbors, which feels ambitious for people in nightgowns. Others used the interval to think, to write, or to carve a spoon. Spoon carving at 2 a.m. was not considered eccentric. It was considered productive. In some homes, it was also when minor confessions happened. The quiet dark seemed more forgiving, a broken tool, a forgotten chore, a slightly exaggerated story about the size of a fish. All came out before the second sleep. In this suspended quiet, thoughts became their own kind of visitors, hopes, regrets, small plans for tomorrow, whether to mend the sock or let it die, whether the geese had forgiven the incident near the pond, whether the neighbor's son had truly fallen in love or just wanted free pie. These were not heavy thoughts, just soft ones. And somewhere between breath and murmur, night held the house. No matter how cold the room or how cramped the bed, there was something undeniably human in this moment of shared stillness. No one was alone. Everyone was horizontal. The world had narrowed to the size of a single room, a few bodies, and the promise that morning would come again. The second sleep, once it returned, came slower and quieter. There was no official moment when it began. It simply crept in. A hand that had been scratching the blanket stopped mid-motion. A breath deepened. A fire shifted in its ashes without commentary. One by one, the minds in the room drifted from the world into whatever world sleep still had to offer. The hours between second sleep and dawn were the coldest. Even in summer, a chill settled over everything. Roofs trapped the night air. Walls held shadows too long. Beds, if one could call them that, became negotiations between warmth and splinters. Anyone waking during this stretch did so with a groan and a prayer for blankets to have grown overnight. Outside, the village was as silent as it ever became. Not truly quiet. Nothing ever was, but deeply muffled. Wind threaded between chimneys. A distant dog gave up its vigilance halfway through a bark. Somewhere, an owl questioned a mouse's life decisions. In this murky stillness, time felt detached, floating like breath across frozen glass. In households across Europe, segmented sleep was understood without explanation. Waking in the middle of the night was normal, even expected. There were no bedside clocks to provoke panic. No sense that one had failed to sleep properly. The interruption was used. People prayed, meditated, or listened to the sounds of the house. It was not disruption. It was simply pause. In some communities, it was believed that waking during this time granted one a sliver of divine awareness, that the body, no longer burdened by motion or noise, became a better vessel for insight. Not that anyone expected full enlightenment while wrapped in wool and pressed between three siblings, but still, one could hope. Others used the time practically. Embers were stirred, the fire reawakened with the gentleness of habit. A drink of water was taken from a clay jug that had never truly been clean. A child was tucked back under a blanket. A dog was gently removed from someone's head. These tasks were not urgent. They were offered to the dark as a way of saying, yes, we are still here. There were also those who slipped outside, quietly, without fanfare. A quick moment beneath the stars, or in the privy, or by the barn where the ox had been coughing. This was not adventure. It was necessity. But it was also the only time a person might be entirely alone, if only for a minute. The sky, black and immense, asked no questions. The cold air reset whatever had been wrong with the evening. Dreams during second sleep were different. Stranger, longer, less connected to the ordinary complaints of the day. People remembered them with more clarity, though often less logic. Dreams of flying geese in church robes, of neighbors who had become root vegetables, of impossible staircases guarded by cats that spoke Latin. No one questioned these dreams. They were not entertainment. They were night's way of continuing the conversation. As dawn approached, homes stirred again, though reluctantly. It began with the fire or the lack of it. Someone noticed the cold. Someone else coughed. A third person tried to fake continued sleep, but failed when their foot was kicked. Slowly, without joy or music, bodies reassembled into people. The second waking had begun. This second waking differed from the first. It was not as sharp, less immediate. The body moved out of obligation, not surprise. Eyes stayed closed longer, limbs stretched as if unsure they belonged to their owner. The smell of last night's stew still lingered in the air, mixed with smoke and something no one wanted to identify. The fire was coaxed back to life. If the embers had survived, it was seen as a triumph. If they had not, the youngest person was sent out to borrow flame from a neighbor. Again. This was met with groans and the occasional philosophical monologue about the unfairness of life, delivered while putting on a damp cloak. Clothing was reassembled, not changed. No one changed anything unless absolutely required, but adjusted. Belts retightened, laces reknotted, cloaks reflung across shoulders. If a hole had grown larger overnight, it was now acknowledged. If socks were missing, they were declared cursed and replaced with hope. One tradition common in several regions involved mumbling a charm or blessing upon the second waking. Nothing dramatic, just a small rhyme to protect the household from accidents during the day. No slip, no spill, no burn, no break, or its local equivalent, said to no one in particular. A little protection against splinters, spilled water, or sudden geese. Animals woke as well. Chickens rustled, cows snorted. Dogs, already awake but pretending otherwise, stretched with great drama. The barn called, the fields waited, the air smelled like expectations and unfinished work. And still, most people lingered just a little longer by the hearth, waiting for the heat to confirm their choices. The second waking was not universally acknowledged. Some homes rose in a single stretch, pretending the night had passed without interruption. But most accepted the gap between sleeps as simply part of the rhythm. One did not comment on it. One simply folded it into the day like salt into dough, present, invisible, necessary. In towns, the first echoes of morning began during this phase. A bell might toll from a distant chapel. A cart might creak across cobbles. Someone lit a lamp too early and someone else muttered that it was too soon. The city began to breathe, slowly, like a giant made of mud and gossip. Among monks, the approach of morning was marked with matins, the final set of prayers in a long night of vigilance. Candles flickered in stone halls, psalms echoed off walls, sandals shuffled. The world turned quietly from darkness toward light, helped along by sacred whispers and cold fingers. In the villages, the light returned grudgingly, first a greyness, then the hint of shape in the outline of the shutters. Then the realization that someone had again left the tools outside and that a chicken had somehow ended up in the house. No one celebrated dawn. It was simply noted, filed away. Dreams faded. Night retreated. People began sorting their thoughts into useful and useless piles. What needed doing? What could be ignored? Who would pretend not to hear the first request to fetch water? These were questions of survival, disguised as routine. Not every home resumed at the same pace. Some rose like bread in a cold oven, slow, lumpy, and vaguely resentful. Others snapped into motion, driven by habit, hunger, or the need to reach market before all the good eggs were gone. But regardless of pace, the day began again. One fringe belief warned against stepping out of bed with the left foot first, claiming it invited a crooked day, bad weather, sour milk, and clumsy fingers. A few followed this rule with superstitious care. Others stepped out any way they pleased and blamed fate when they dropped something. Either way, the day got blamed for whatever happened next. Water was fetched, not a chore so much as a pilgrimage. The path to the well was sacred and mildly hazardous. Mud, goats, and nosy neighbors guarded it. The water itself was never cold enough or clean enough, but it was all that existed. Someone always spilled a little, and someone else always complained that they had. Bread from the night before was reheated near the hearth, or not reheated. Sometimes it was just chewed with the determination of someone pretending not to have teeth issues. A bit of cheese might be sliced, a few herbs crushed into a drink that claimed to be medicinal. No one asked what it was supposed to cure, only that it be warm. A rooster crowed. No one thanked it. Everyone noticed. Some rolled their eyes. Some silently debated whether it was time to replace the rooster. That conversation never ended. Roosters were immortal in opinion, if not in lifespan. The house filled with motion, slow motion, people stepping around each other, patching clothes, wiping faces, complaining about nothing with the energy of people avoiding real tasks. The dog barked at its own shadow. A pot fell and someone shouted dramatically, though no one responded. It was morning, and through all of it, the space left behind by the second sleep faded. The night retreated fully. Life stood up, shook off its straw, and tried again. Morning light had fully arrived, though no one had requested it. The house, already awake in motion if not in spirit, now leaned into its duties with the reluctant enthusiasm of people who had accepted their fates. There were no trumpets, there was no ceremonial welcome for the sun. It simply appeared through the shutters, and everyone pretended it had not caught them yawning. Tasks resumed with a sense of inevitability rather than inspiration. The fire was re-stoked, ashes were scooped and muttered over. Porridge, if available, was reheated and made only marginally more edible by adding whatever survived the pantry's winter. This might include dried berries, honey, or the eternal optimism that hunger would disguise taste. Children were given instructions, most of which were ignored. A request to carry water became a philosophical inquiry about why water was heavy. A command to sweep the floor was met with a discussion on whether sweeping before or after the porridge mattered. These debates ended only when a wooden spoon was raised, not in violence but in symbolic authority. Adults returned to their stations, in the field, if the season allowed, in the barn, always. Wool needed carding, tools needed checking, something smelled like it should not be ignored. A hen was missing again. And somewhere, out of sight but not out of mind, someone had forgotten the bucket. The sounds of the village formed a tapestry. Hooves clopped past gates. A hammer rang out from the farrier's shed. Voices drifted from garden fences. Chickens protested decisions they did not understand. A dog barked at a passing cloud. Life was not coordinated, but it was synchronized, everyone moving in overlapping circles, each unaware of the others, but part of the same slow machinery. One family argued about a missing cloak. Another discovered that their door had swollen shut. A third spent 15 minutes discussing whether the neighbor's goose looked suspicious. The news cycle had begun. Breakfasts were modest. The second meal of the day, if it happened, depended on the first. If one ate well upon waking, then the midday pause might be light, a crust of bread, a sliver of salted meat, or a bite of whatever had not been claimed by mold. If one had skipped early food due to distractions or an optimistic goat, then midday became more important. Weather dictated all ambition. A sunny morning might tempt someone into optimism. Rain crushed dreams before they left the threshold. Wind was greeted with muttered suspicions and sudden decisions to postpone anything involving ladders. The sky had more authority than the village elder. In wealthier households, breakfast arrived in courses: bread with jam, a soft cheese, a warm drink of ale or spiced milk. Servants moved like practiced shadows. No one made eye contact until at least the third course. Conversation was permitted only after the family patriarch had sighed deeply and declared the day tolerable. Among monks, breakfast was simple and silent. A bit of bread, perhaps some dried fruit, and a routine that reminded everyone that food was not for pleasure, but fuel. Every bite was chewed with awareness. Every swallow echoed within stone walls. Even burps were considered theological statements if delivered at the wrong time. Among the common folk, breakfast was as quick as it was forgettable. There was too much to do. The pigs did not wait. The barley field did not weed itself. The goats continued to defy containment. One could not explain to a goat that one was finishing breakfast. A goat simply left. One mainstream detail that scholars now agree upon is the repetition of daily patterns. The structure of these rural mornings changed little across the decades. The tools changed shape. The barns leaned differently. But the cycle of waking, working, feeding, and forgetting stayed consistent. The rhythm was not optional. It was the only melody most people knew. That consistency did not mean it was easy. There were always setbacks, a sick animal, a broken tool, a neighbor with urgent complaints about imaginary property lines. The entire day could be undone by a single loose hinge or a stone in the wrong boot. People adapted not by solving problems but by accepting them as permanent guests. One fringe belief, mostly found in northern areas, warned that speaking too loudly before the church bell rang would startle the day, causing mishaps. Some families practiced morning whispering with religious fervor. Others forgot and then explained stubbed toes or spilled porridge as divine punishment. It was never the fault of the furniture. By late morning, the house began to breathe differently. Beds were cleared of straw, blankets were hung to air out, chamber pots were emptied without applause, laundry was considered, then postponed. If it had not been washed yet, it probably did not need washing today either. This was logic, not laziness. Children returned from early chores with elaborate explanations. The geese had rebelled. The path to the well had disappeared. Someone had tried to carry a stick and lost a shoe. Adults listened with the patience of people who had once done the same and responded with vague encouragement or threats to reassign tasks. The elderly had found their rhythm as well. Some sat by the window and offered commentary on the weather, which was helpful because everyone else could also see the weather. Some recounted stories that involved barns, storms, or vegetables behaving strangely. These tales were neither useful nor accurate, but they were comforting. The house was no longer sleepy. It was firmly awake. The air inside smelled of smoke, wool, and effort. Outside, the sun hovered with intent, as if daring someone to take a break. No one accepted the dare. There was still too much to do. Straw beds were shaken and restuffed. Firewood was stacked into patterns that only made sense to the person stacking them. Salt was checked because running out meant social collapse. If there was a moment to rest, it was taken while pretending to inspect a tool. One sat, wiped a brow, and muttered about the alignment of the moon. It was during this stretch that people prepared for the evening without realizing it. Dough was started, beans were soaked, herbs were chopped with vague guesses about their identities. What was edible and what was mildly poisonous lived side by side in the same bowl. Luck, again, played its usual role in dinner. Someone asked if the neighbor's goat had been seen. Someone else answered yes, but the answer was not convincing. Goats did not respect boundaries or schedules. If one appeared in the field unannounced, no one was surprised. If it spoke Latin, some would raise an eyebrow, but still not intervene. By now, most homes had hit their peak energy. The work had fully resumed. Conversations had faded into grunts. The village buzzed not with news, but with noise. The hammer, the bucket, the scolded child, the disgruntled sheep, every home its own orchestra of necessary friction. There were signs, subtle ones, that the rhythm of the day would soon begin to tilt again. A glance at the sky, the tightening of a cloak, a sheep returning without fanfare. The suggestion, unspoken, that perhaps everything that needed doing had been attempted, and most of it had failed in charmingly predictable ways. The midday meal, if there was one, depended on fortune. A bit of bread reheated against stone. A handful of herbs tossed with vinegar and hope. Cold porridge that had grown more philosophical than edible. If someone had visited market, there might be pickled fish. If someone had not, there was always complaining. Time crept forward. There was no clock to argue with, only the light. Shadows grew stouter. Chickens grew louder. Somewhere, a child declared it was still morning, and was met with a silence so profound, it became law. The afternoon approached, and beneath all of it, the knowledge that night would come again, that the beds would be repopulated, that someone would forget to close the shutters and someone else would dream of flying turnips. Life was repetition, but it was also rhythm. And rhythm, when done well, began to feel like peace. The village had quieted again. Not fully, and not forever, but enough for stillness to reclaim a corner of the day. The fire had been banked, the tools had been returned to their places, though not always the correct ones. The air smelled like cooling bread, smouldering ash, and earth that had finally released its warmth. It was not night yet, but it was no longer afternoon. Inside the homes, voices dropped in pitch. Conversations trailed off mid-thought, replaced by gestures, shrugs, and the kind of silence that grows out of familiarity rather than discomfort. No one announced that the day was ending. No one needed to. People moved more slowly. They lingered longer by the fire. Someone adjusted the shutters just enough to let in the fading light without admitting the breeze. The floor had been swept. The stew had been stirred. A child had been scolded for a reason no one remembered. The blanket was where it belonged again. The bucket, mercifully, had been found. Outside, the sky softened into its final colors. Pale rose, smudged blue, a hint of rust like iron left in the rain. Birds that had spent the day shouting their existence from rooftops now whispered it from tree branches. A single cart creaked in the distance, its wheels arguing gently with the road. The wind no longer carried urgency. It carried hints of hay, chimney smoke, and someone's idea of supper. Evening in the village was not dramatic. It did not arrive with bells or music. It arrived the way a familiar blanket does, quietly, comfortably, and with a few loose threads. The shadows stretched. The dog yawned. Someone took off their shoes and did not put them away. Inside, the last meal of the day was being eaten or had already disappeared. It was rarely celebratory. Often it was simply hot. Bread dipped into broth. A piece of cheese that had survived the week. Whatever was edible, manageable, and unlikely to provoke complaints louder than a sigh. Afterward, the bowls were not scrubbed so much as acknowledged with water. Hands were dried on aprons that had known better days. Someone folded something. Someone else unfolded it again by mistake. The hearth became the room's anchor, even if the fire had dimmed to a whisper. It was in this pause, this gentle exhale of a day, that sleep began to creep in, not immediately, and not all at once. First in the posture of the people around the fire, then in the slowness of their sentences, then in the way one person blinked too long and another stopped pretending to be interested in the mending pile. There was a comfort in the repetition. The same words said, the same questions asked, the same responses given with slightly different sarcasm. Someone always said the weather was changing. Someone else always disagreed. These rituals mattered not for their content, but for their presence. They made the evening real. Children were the first to drift, though never willingly. They claimed They were wide awake, even as their heads tilted forward. A gentle nudge, a murmur, a tug of the blanket, and they were gone, curled against someone's side, breathing like tiny bellows in the dimness. Elders followed next, not into full sleep, but into that waiting place where memory and rest shake hands. Their eyes stayed open, their fingers stayed busy with string or fabric, but their minds had already stepped sideways into older stories and quieter rooms. And then came the fire watchers, the last few to sleep, the ones who poked at coals, adjusted logs, and made sure that something would still be glowing in the morning. These were not insomniacs, they were guardians of habit, stewards of the ember. They stayed not out of worry, but because someone always had. Outside, the stars were arranging themselves with quiet determination. The moon, fat or thin, judgmental or indifferent, hovered in her accustomed place. Somewhere in the distance, an owl declared its territory, and a fox considered the morality of stealing eggs. Inside, the room had hushed. Breathing deepened, blankets shifted, the fire exhaled. Someone murmured a final word, half dream, half prayer. There was no need to respond. Everything that needed saying had already been said, and what had not would wait until morning. And so the day ended, not with a moment of significance, but with the familiar silence of people who had done enough, eaten enough, and heard enough geese for one lifetime. The house rested. The night returned to its watch, and the rhythm that had begun at dawn folded in on itself, ready to begin again.